Chapter 7 The next 6 months were the happiest time of her life for Herminia. All day long she worked hard with her classes, and often in the evenings Alan Merrick dropped in for sweet converse and companionship. Too free from any taint of sin or shame herself ever to suspect that others could misinterpret her actions, Herminia was hardly aware how the gossip of Bower Lane made free in time with the name of the young lady who had taken a cottage in the Row, and whose relations with the tall gentleman that called so much in the evenings were beginning to attract the attention of the neighbourhood. The poor slaves of washerwomen and working men's wives all around, with whom contented slavery to a drunken husband was the only respectable condition, couldn't understand for the life of them how the pretty young lady should make her name so cheap. "And her that pretends to be so charitable and that, and goes about in the parish like a district visitor." Though, to be sure, it had already struck the minds of Bower Lane that Herminia never went to church nor chapel. And when people cut themselves adrift from church and chapel, why, what sort of morality can you reasonably expect of them? Nevertheless, Herminia's manners were so sweet and engaging to rich and poor alike that Bower Lane seriously regretted what it took to be her lapse from grace. Poor purblind Bower Lane! A lifetime would have failed it to discern for itself how infinitely higher than its slavish respectability was Herminia's freedom. In which respect, indeed, Bower Lane was no doubt on a dead level with Belgravia, or, for the matter of that, with Lambeth Palace. But Herminia, for her part, never discovered she was talked about. To the pure all things are pure, and Herminia was dowered with that perfect purity. And though Bower Lane lay but some few hundred yards off from the Carlisle Place Girls' School, the social gulf between them yet yawned so wide that good old Miss Smith Waters from Cambridge, the head mistress of the school, never caught a single echo of the washerwomen's gossip. Herminia's life through those 6 months was one unclouded honeymoon. On Sundays she and Alan would go out of town together, and stroll across the breezy summit of Leith Hill, or among the brown heather and garrulous pine woods that perfume the radiating spurs of Hind Head with their aromatic resins. Her love for Alan was profound and absorbing, while, as for Alan, the more he gazed into the calm depths of that crystal soul, the more deeply did he admire it. Gradually she was raising him to her own level. It is impossible to mix with a lofty nature, and not acquire in time some tincture of its nobler and more generous sentiments. Herminia was weaning Alan by degrees from the world. She was teaching him to see that moral purity and moral earnestness are worth more, after all, than to dwell with purple hangings in all the tents of iniquity. She was making him understand and sympathise with the motives which led her stoutly on to her final martyrdom, which made her submit without a murmur of discontent to her great renunciation. As yet, however, there was no hint or forecast of actual martyrdom. On the contrary, her life flowed in all the halo of a honeymoon. It was a honeymoon, too, undisturbed by the petty jars and discomforts of domestic life. She saw Alan too seldom for either ever to lose the keen sense of fresh delight in the other's presence. When she met him, she thrilled to the delicate fingertips. Herminia had planned it so of set purpose. In her reasoned philosophy of life, she had early decided that 'tis the wear and tear of too close daily intercourse which turns unawares the lover into the husband, and she had determined that in her own converse with the man she loved, that cause of disillusion should never intrude itself. They conserved their romance through all their plighted and united life. Herminia had afterwards no recollections of Alan to look back upon, save ideally happy ones. So 6 months wore away. On the memory of those 6 months Herminia was to subsist for half a lifetime. At the end of that time, Alan began to fear that if she did not soon withdraw from the Carlisle Place school, Miss Smith-Waters might begin to ask inconvenient questions. Herminia, ever true to her principles, was for stopping on till the bitter end, and compelling Miss Smith-Waters to dismiss her from her situation. But Alan, more worldly wise, foresaw that such a course must inevitably result in needless annoyance and humiliation for Herminia. And Herminia was now beginning to be so far influenced by Alan's personality that she yielded the point with reluctance to his masculine judgment. It must be always so. The man must needs retain for many years to come the personal hegemony he has usurped over the woman, and the woman who once accepts him as lover or as husband must give way in the end, even in matters of principle, to his virile self-assertion. She would be less a woman, and he less a man, were any other result possible. Deep down in the very roots of the idea of sex we come on that prime antithesis, the male active and aggressive, the female sedentary, passive and receptive. And even on the broader question, experience shows one it is always so in the world we live in. No man or woman can go through life in consistent obedience to any high principle, not even the willing and deliberate martyrs. We must bow to circumstances. Herminia had made up her mind beforehand for the crown of martyrdom, the one possible guerdon this planet can bestow upon really noble and disinterested action. And she never shrank from any necessary pang incidental to the prophet's and martyr's existence. Yet even so, in a society almost wholly composed of mean and petty souls, incapable of comprehending or appreciating any exalted moral standpoint, it is practically impossible to live from day to day in accordance with a higher or purer standard. The martyr who should try so to walk without deviation of any sort, turning neither to the right nor to the left in the smallest particular, must accomplish his martyrdom prematurely on the pettiest side issues, and would never live at all to assert at the stake the great truth which is the lodestar and goal of his existence. So Herminia gave way. Sadly against her will she gave way. One morning in early March she absented herself from her place in the classroom without even taking leave of her beloved schoolgirls, whom she had tried so hard unobtrusively to train up towards a rational understanding of the universe around them, and sat down to write a final letter of farewell to poor, straight-laced, kind-hearted Miss Smith-Waters. She sat down to it with a sigh, for Miss Smith-Waters, though her outlook upon the cosmos was through one narrow chink, was a good soul up to her lights, and had been really fond and proud of Herminia. She had rather shown her off, indeed, as a social trump-card to the hesitating parent. "This is our second mistress, Miss Barton. You know her father, perhaps? Such an excellent man, the Dean of Dunwich." And now Herminia sat down with a heavy heart, thinking to herself what a stab of pain the avowal she had to make would send throbbing through that gentle old breast, and how absolutely incapable dear Miss Smith-Waters could be of ever appreciating the conscientious reasons which had led her, Iphigenia-like, to her self-imposed sacrifice. But for all that, she wrote her letter through, delicately, sweetly, with feminine tact and feminine reticence. She told Miss Smith-Waters frankly enough all it was necessary Miss Smith-Waters should know. But she said it with such daintiness that even that conventionalized and hidebound old maid couldn't help feeling and recognizing the purity and nobility of her misguided action. Poor child, Miss Smith-Waters thought. She was mistaken, of course, sadly and grievously mistaken. But then 'twas her heart that misled her, no doubt. And Miss Smith-Waters, having dim recollections of a far-away time when she herself too possessed some rudimentary fragment of such a central vascular organ, fairly cried over the poor girl's letter with sympathetic shame and remorse and vexation. Miss Smith-Waters could hardly be expected to understand that if Herminia had thought her conduct in the faintest degree wrong, or indeed anything but the highest and best for humanity, she could never conceivably have allowed even that loving heart of hers to hurry her into it. For Herminia's devotion to principle was not less, but far greater than Miss Smith-Waters' own. Only, as it happened, the principles themselves were diametrically opposite. Herminia wrote her note with not a few tears for poor Miss Smith-Waters' disappointment. That is the worst of living a life morally ahead of your contemporaries. What you do with profoundest conviction of its eternal rightness cannot fail to arouse hostile and painful feelings, even in the souls of the most right-minded of your friends who still live in bondage to the conventional lies and the conventional injustices. It is the good, indeed, who are most against you. Still, Herminia steeled her heart to tell the simple truth, how, for the right's sake and humanity's, she had made up her mind to eschew the accursed thing, and to strike one bold blow for the freedom and unfettered individuality of women. She knew in what obloquy her action would involve her, she said. But she knew too that to do right for right's sake was a duty imposed by nature upon every one of us, and that the clearer we could see ahead, and the farther in front we could look, the more profoundly did that duty shine forth for us. For her own part, she had never shrunk from doing what she knew to be right for mankind in the end, though she felt sure it must lead her to personal misery. Yet unless one woman were prepared to lead the way, no freedom was possible. She had found a man with whom she could spend her life in sympathy and united usefulness, and with him she had elected to spend it in the way pointed out to us by nature. Acting on his advice, though somewhat against her own judgment, she meant to leave England for the present, only returning again when she could return with the dear life they had both been instrumental in bringing into the world, and to which henceforth her main attention must be directed. She signed it, "Your ever grateful and devoted Herminia." Poor Miss Smith-Waters laid down that astonishing, that incredible letter in a perfect whirl of amazement and stupefaction. She didn't know what to make of it. It seemed to run counter to all her preconceived ideas of moral action. That a young girl should venture to think for herself at all about right and wrong was passing strange. That she should arrive at original notions upon those abstruse subjects which were not the notions of constituted authority and of the universal slave-drivers and obscurantists generally, notions full of luminousness upon the real relations and duties of our race, was to poor cramped Miss Smith-Waters well-nigh inconceivable. That a young girl should prefer freedom to slavery, should deem it more moral to retain her divinely conferred individuality in spite of the world, than to yield it up to a man for life in return for the price of her board and lodging, should refuse to sell her own body for a comfortable home and the shelter of a name, These things seemed to Miss Smith-Waters, with her smaller catechism standards of right and wrong, scarcely short of sheer madness. Yet Herminia had so endeared herself to the old lady's soul that on receipt of her letter Miss Smith-Waters went upstairs to her own room with a neuralgic headache, and never again in her life referred to her late second mistress in any other terms than as "my poor, dear, sweet, misguided Herminia." But when it became known next morning in Bower Lane that the queenly-looking schoolmistress who used to go round among our girls with tickets for concerts and lectures and that, had disappeared suddenly with the nice-looking young man who used to come a-courting her on Sundays and evenings, the amazement and surprise of respectable Bower Lane was simply unbounded. "Who would have thought," the red-faced matrons of the cottages remarked over their quart of bitter, "the poor thing had it in her. But there, it's these demure ones as is always the slyest." For Bower Lane could only judge that austere soul by its own vulgar standard, as did also Belgravia. Most low minds, indeed, imagine absolute hypocrisy must be involved in any striving after goodness and abstract right-doing on the part of any who happen to disbelieve in their own bloodthirsty deities or their own vile, woman-degrading and prostituting morality. In the topsy-turvy philosophy of Bower Lane and of Belgravia, what is usual is right, while any conscious striving to be better and nobler than the mass around one is regarded at once as either insane or criminal. End of chapter 7. Chapter 8. They were bound for Italy, so Alan had decided. Turning over in his mind the pros and cons of the situation, he had wisely determined that Herminia's confinement had better take place somewhere else than in England. The difficulties and inconveniences which block the way in English lodgings would have been well nigh insufferable. In Italy, people would only know that an English signora and her husband had taken apartments for a month or two in some solemn old palazzo. To Herminia, indeed, this expatriation at such a moment was in many ways to the last degree distasteful. For her own part, she hated the merest appearance of concealment, and would rather have flaunted the open expression of her supreme moral faith before the eyes of all London. But Alan pointed out to her the many practical difficulties, amounting almost to impossibilities, which beset such a course. And Herminia, though it was hateful to her thus to yield to the immoral prejudices of a false social system, gave way at last to Alan's repeated expression of the necessity for prudent and practical action. She would go with him to Italy, she said, as a proof of her affection and her confidence in his judgment, though she still thought the right thing was to stand by her guns fearlessly and fight it out to the bitter end, undismayed, in England. On the morning of their departure, Alan called to see his father and explain the situation. He felt some explanation was by this time necessary. As yet, no one in London knew anything officially as to his relations with Herminia, and for Herminia's sake Alan had hitherto kept them perfectly private. But now further reticence was both useless and undesirable. He determined to make a clean breast of the whole story to his father. It was early for a barrister to be leaving town for the Easter vacation, and though Alan had chambers of his own in Lincoln's Inn, where he lived by himself, he was so often in and out of the house in Harley Street that his absence from London would at once have attracted the parental attention. Dr. Merrick was a model of the close-shaven, clear-cut London consultant. His shirt-front was as impeccable as his moral character was spotless, in the way that Belgravia and Harley Street still understood spotlessness. He was tall and straight, and unbent by age, The professional poker which he had swallowed in early life seemed to stand him in good stead after 60 years, though his hair had whitened fast, and his brow was furrowed with most deliberative wrinkles. So unapproachable he looked that not even his own sons dared speak frankly before him. His very smile was restrained. He hardly permitted himself for a moment that weak human relaxation. Alan called at Harley Street immediately after breakfast, just a quarter of an hour before the time allotted to his father's first patient. Dr. Merrick received him in the consulting room with an interrogative raising of those straight, thin eyebrows. The mere look on his face disconcerted Alan. With an effort, the son began and explained his errand. His father settled himself down into his ample and dignified professional chair, old oak round-backed, and with head half-turned and hands folded in front of him, seemed to diagnose with rapt attention this singular form of psychological malady. When Alan paused for a second between his halting sentences and floundered about in search of a more delicate way of gliding over the thin ice, his father eyed him closely with those keen grey orbs, and after a moment's hesitation put in a "Well, continue," without the faintest sign of any human emotion. Alan, thus driven to it, admitted awkwardly, bit by bit, that he was leaving London before the end of term because he had managed to get himself into delicate relations with a lady. Dr. Merrick twirled his thumbs, and in a colourless voice inquired, without relaxing a muscle of his set face, "What sort of lady, please? A lady of the ballet?" "Oh, no!" Alan cried, giving a little start of horror. "Quite different from that. A real lady." "They always are real ladies, for the most part brought down by untoward circumstances," his father responded coldly. "As a rule, indeed, I observe they're clergymen's daughters." "This one is," Alan answered, growing hot. "In point of fact, to prevent your saying anything you might afterwards regret, I think I'd better mention the lady's name. It's Miss Herminia Barton, the Dean of Dunwich's daughter." His father drew a long breath. The corners of the clear-cut mouth dropped down for a second, and the straight, thin eyebrows were momentarily elevated, but he gave no other overt sign of dismay or astonishment. "That makes a great difference, of course," he answered after a long pause. "She is a lady, I admit, and she's been to Girton." "She has," the son replied, scarcely knowing how to continue. Dr. Merrick twirled his thumbs once more, with outward calm, for a minute or two. This was most inconvenient in a professional family. "And I understand you to say," he went on in a pitiless voice, "Miss Barton's state of health is such that you think it advisable to remove her at once for her confinement to Italy?" "Exactly so," Alan answered, gulping down his discomfort. The father gazed at him long and steadily. "Well, I always knew you were a fool," he said at last with paternal candour. "But I never yet knew you were quite such a fool as this business shows you. You'll have to marry the girl now in the end. Why the devil couldn't you marry her outright at first, instead of seducing her?" "I did not seduce her," Alan answered stoutly. "No man on earth could ever succeed in seducing that stainless woman." Dr. Merrick stared hard at him, without changing his attitude on his old oak chair. Was the boy going mad, or what the dickens did he mean by it? "You have seduced her," he said slowly, "and she is not stainless if she has allowed you to do so." It is the innocence which survives experience that I value, not the innocence which dies with it," Alan answered gravely. "I don't understand these delicate distinctions," Dr Merrick interposed with a polite sneer. "I gather from what you said just now that the lady is shortly expecting her confinement. And as she isn't married, you tell me, I naturally infer that somebody must have seduced her, either you or some other man." It was Alan's turn now to draw himself up very stiffly. "I beg your pardon," he answered. "You have no right to speak in such a tone about a lady in Miss Barton's position. Miss Barton has conscientious scruples about the marriage tie, which in theory I share with her. She was unwilling to enter into any relations with me except in terms of perfect freedom." "I see," the old man went on with provoking calmness. "She preferred, in fact, to be not your wife, but your mistress." Alan rose indignantly. "Father," he said with just wrath, "if you insist upon discussing this matter with me in such a spirit, I must refuse to stay here. I came to tell you the difficulty in which I find myself, and to explain to you my position. If you won't let me tell you in my own way, I must leave the house without having laid the facts before you." The father spread his two palms in front of him with demonstrative openness. "As you will," he answered. "My time is much engaged. I expect a patient at 10:15. You must be brief, please." Alan made one more effort. In a very earnest voice he began to expound to his father Herminia's point of view. Dr Merrick listened for a second or two in calm impatience. Then he consulted his watch. "Excuse me," he said. "I have just 3 minutes. Let us get at once to the practical part, the therapeutics of the case, omitting its etiology. You're going to take the young lady to Italy. When she gets there, will she marry you? And do you expect me to help in providing for you both after this insane adventure?" Alan's face was red as fire. "She will not marry me when she gets to Italy," he answered decisively. "And I don't want you to do anything to provide for either of us." The father looked at him with the face he was wont to assume in scanning the appearance of a confirmed monomaniac. "She will not marry you," he answered slowly, "and you intend to go on living with her in open concubinage. A lady of birth and position. Is that your meaning?" "Father!" Alan cried despairingly. "Herminia would not consent to live with me on any other terms. To her it would be disgraceful, shameful, a sin, a reproach, a dereliction of principle. She couldn't go back upon her whole past life. She lives for nothing else but the emancipation of women." "And you will aid and abet her in her folly?" the father asked, looking up sharply at him. "You will persist in this evil course? You will face the world and openly defy morality?" "I will not counsel the woman I most love and admire to purchase her own ease by proving false to her convictions," Alan answered stoutly. Dr Merrick gazed at the watch on his table once more. Then he rose and rang the bell. "Patient here?" he asked curtly. "Show him in, then, at once. And, Napper, if Mr Alan Merrick ever calls again, will you tell him I'm out, and your mistress as well, and all the young ladies?" He turned coldly to Alan. "I must guard your mother and sisters at least," he said in a chilly voice, "from the contamination of this woman's opinions." Alan bowed without a word and left the room. He never again saw the face of his father. End of chapter 8. Chapter 9. Alan Merrick strode from his father's door that day, stung with a burning sense of wrong and injustice. More than ever before in his life, he realised to himself the abject hollowness of that conventional code which masquerades in our midst as a system of morals. If he had continued to live single, as we hypocritically phrase it, and so helped by one unit to spread the festering social canker of prostitution, on which a basis, like some medieval castle on its foul dungeon vaults, the entire superstructure of our outwardly decent modern society is reared, his father no doubt would have shrugged his shoulders and blinked his cold eyes, and commended the wise young man for abstaining from marriage till his means could permit him to keep a wife of his own class in the way she was accustomed to. The wretched victims of that vile system might die unseen and unpitied in some hideous back slum without touching one chord of remorse or regret in Dr. Merrick's nature. He was steeled against their suffering. Or again, if Alan had sold his virility for gold to some rich heiress of his set, like Ethel Waterton, had bartered his freedom to be her wedded paramour in a loveless marriage, his father would not only have gladly acquiesced, but would have congratulated his son on his luck and his prudence. Yet, because Alan had chosen rather to form a blameless union of pure affection with a woman who was in every way his moral and mental superior, but in despite of the conventional ban of society, Dr. Merrick had cast him off as an open reprobate. And why? Simply because that union was unsanctioned by the exponents of a law they despised, and unblessed by the priests of a creed they rejected. Alan saw at once it is not the intrinsic moral value of an act such people think about, but the light in which it is regarded by a selfish society. Unchastity, it has been well said, is union without love, and Alan would have none of it. He went back to Herminia more than ever convinced of that spotless woman's moral superiority to every one else he had ever met with. She sat, a lonely soul, enthroned amid the halo of her own perfect purity. To Alan she seemed like one of those early Italian Madonnas, lost in a glory of light that surrounds and half hides them. He reverenced her far too much to tell her all that had happened. How could he wound those sweet ears with his father's coarse epithets? They took the club train that afternoon to Paris. There they slept the night in a fusty hotel near the Gare du Nord, and went on in the morning by the daylight express to Switzerland. At Lucerne and Milan they broke the journey once more. Herminia had never yet gone further afield from England than Paris, and this first glimpse of a wider world was intensely interesting to her. Who can help being pleased indeed with that wonderful St. Gothard, the crystal green Reuss shattering itself in white spray into emerald pools by the side of the railway, Wasen Church perched high upon its solitary hilltop, the Biaschina ravine, the cleft rocks of Faido, the serpentine twists and turns of the ramping line as it mounts or descends its spiral zigzags, dewy alpine pasture, tossed masses of landslip, white narcissus on the banks, snowy peaks in the background, all alike were fresh visions of delight to Herminia, and she drank it all in with the pure childish joy of a poetic nature. It was the Switzerland of her dreams, reinforced and complemented by unsuspected detail. One trouble alone disturbed her peace of mind upon that delightful journey. Alan entered their names at all the hotels where they stopped as Mr. and Mrs. Alan Merrick of London. That deception, as Herminia held it, cost her many qualms of conscience. But Alan, with masculine common sense, was firm upon the point that no other description was practically possible. And Herminia yielded with a sigh to his greater worldly wisdom. She had yet to learn the lesson which sooner or later comes home to all the small minority who care a pin about righteousness, that in a world like our own, it is impossible for the righteous always to act consistently up to their most sacred convictions. At Milan, they stopped long enough to snatch a glimpse of the cathedral and to take a hasty walk through the pictured glories of the Brera. A vague suspicion began to cross Herminia's mind as she gazed at the girlish Madonna of the Sposalizio, that perhaps she wasn't quite as well adapted to love Italy as Switzerland. Nature, she understood, was art yet a closed book to her? If so, she would be sorry. For Alan, in whom the artistic sense was largely developed, loved his Italy dearly, and it would be a real cause of regret to her if she fell short in any way of Alan's expectations. Moreover, at table d'hôte that evening, a slight episode occurred which roused to the full once more poor Herminia's tender conscience. Talk had somehow turned on Shelley's Italian wanderings, and a benevolent-looking clergyman opposite, with that vacantly well-meaning smile peculiar to a certain type of country rector, was apologising in what he took to be a broad and generous spirit of divine toleration for the great moral teacher's supposed lapses from the normal rule of tight living. Much, the benevolent-looking gentleman opined, with beaming spectacles, must be forgiven to men of genius. Their temptations no doubt are far keener than with most of us. An eager imagination, a vivid sense of beauty, quick readiness to be moved by the sight of physical or moral loveliness, these were palliations, the old clergyman held, of much that seemed wrong and contradictory to our eyes in the lives of so many great men and women. At sound of such immoral and unworthy teaching, Herminia's ardent soul rose up in revolt within her. "Oh, no!" she cried eagerly, leaning across the table as she spoke. "I can't allow that plea. It's degrading to Shelley and to all true appreciation of the duties of genius. Not less but more than most of us is the genius bound to act up with all his might to the highest moral law, to be the prophet and interpreter of the highest moral excellence. To whom much is given, of him much shall be required. Just because the man or woman of genius stands raised on a pedestal so far above the mass, have we the right to expect that he or she should point us the way, should go before us as pioneer, should be more careful of the truth, more disdainful of the wrong, down to the smallest particular, than the ordinary person? There are poor souls born into this world so petty and narrow and wanting in originality that one can only expect them to tread the beaten track, be it ever so cruel and wicked and mistaken. But from a Shelley or a George Eliot we expect greater things, and we have a right to expect them. That's why I can never quite forgive George Eliot, who knew the truth and found freedom for herself and practised it in her life, for upholding in her books the conventional lies, the conventional prejudices. And that's why I can never admire Shelley enough, who, in an age of slavery, refused to abjure or to deny his freedom, but acted unto death to the full height of his principles." The benevolent-looking clergyman gazed aghast at Herminia. Then he turned slowly to Alan.
Your wife," he said in a mild and terrified voice, "is a very advanced lady."
Herminia longed to blurt out the whole simple truth. "I am not his wife. I am not, and could never be wife or slave to any man. This is a very dear friend, and he and I are travelling as friends together." But a warning glance from Alan made her hold her peace with difficulty, and acquiesce as best she might in the virtual deception. Still, the incident went to her heart, and made her more anxious than ever to declare her convictions and her practical obedience to them openly before the world. She remembered, oh, so well, one of her father's sermons that had vividly impressed her in the dear old days at Dunwich Cathedral. It was preached upon the text, "Come ye out, and be ye separate." From Milan they went on direct to Florence. Alan had decided to take rooms for the summer at Perugia, and there to see Herminia safely through her maternal troubles. He loved Perugia, he said. It was cool and high-perched, and then, too, it was such a capital place for sketching. Besides, he was anxious to complete his studies of the early Umbrian painters. But they must just have 1 week at Florence together before they went up among the hills. Florence was the place for a beginner to find out what Italian art was aiming at. You got it there in its full logical development, every phase, step by step, in organic unity, while elsewhere you saw but stages and jumps and results, interrupted here and there by disturbing lacunae. So at Florence they stopped for a week en route, and Herminia first learnt what Florentine art proposed to itself. Ah, that week in Florence! What a dream of delight! 'Twas pure gold to Herminia. How could it well be otherwise? It seemed to her afterwards like the last flicker of joy in a doomed life, before its light went out and left her for ever in utter darkness. To be sure, a week is a terribly cramped and hurried time in which to view Florence, the beloved city, whose ineffable glories need at least 1 whole winter adequately to grasp them. But failing a winter, a week with the gods made Herminia happy. She carried away but a confused phantasmagoria, it is true, of the soaring tower of the Palazzo Vecchio, pointing straight with its slender shaft to heaven; of the swelling dome and huge ribs of the cathedral, seen vast from the terrace in front of San Miniato; of the endless Madonnas and the deathless saints, niched in golden tabernacles at the Uffizi and the Pitti; of the tender grace of Fra Angelico at San Marco; of the infinite wealth and astounding variety of Donatello's marble in the spacious courts of the cool Bargello. But her window at the hotel looked straight as it could look down the humming Calzaioli to the pierced and encrusted front of Giotto's Campanile, with the cupola of San Lorenzo in the middle distance, and the façade of Fiesole standing out deep blue against the dull red glare of evening in the background. If that were not enough to sate and enchant Herminia, she would indeed have been difficult. And with Alan by her side, every joy was doubled. She had never before known what it was to have her lover continuously with her, and his aid in those long corridors where bambinos smiled down at her with childish lips helped her wondrously to understand in so short a time what they sought to convey to her. Alan was steeped in Italy. He knew and entered into the spirit of Tuscan art, and now, for the first time, Herminia found herself face to face with a thoroughly new subject in which Alan could be her teacher from the very beginning, as most men are teachers to the woman who depend upon them. This sense of support and restfulness and clinging was fresh and delightful to her. It is a woman's ancestral part to look up to the man. She is happiest in doing it, and must long remain so. And Herminia was not sorry to find herself in this so much a woman. She thought it delicious to roam through the long halls of some great gallery with Alan, and let him point out to her the pictures he loved best, explain their peculiar merits, and show the subtle relation in which they stood to the pictures that went before them and the pictures that came after them, as well as to the other work of the same master or his contemporaries. It was even no small joy to her to find that he knew so much more about art and its message than she did, that she could look up to his judgment, confide in his opinion, see the truth of his criticism, profit much by his instruction. So well did she use those 7 short days, indeed, that she came to Florence with Fra Angelico, Filippo Lippi, Botticelli, mere names, and she went away from it feeling that she had made them real friends and possessions for a lifetime. So the hours whirled fast in those enchanted halls, and Herminia's soul was enriched by new tastes and new interests. O towers of fretted stone! O jasper and porphyry! Her very state of health made her more susceptible than usual to fresh impressions, and drew Alan at the same time every day into closer union with her. For was not the young life now quickening within her half his and half hers, and did it not seem to make the father, by reflex, nearer and dearer to her? Surely the child that was nurtured unborn on those marble colonnades and those placid St. Catherines must draw in with each pulse of its antenatal nutriment some tincture of beauty, of freedom, of culture. So Herminia thought to herself as she lay awake at night and looked out of the window from the curtains of her bed at the boundless dome and the tall campanile gleaming white in the moonlight. So we have each of us thought, especially the mothers in Israel among us, about the unborn babe that hastens along to its birth with such a radiant halo of the possible future ever gilding and glorifying its unseen forehead. End of chapter 9. Chapter 10. All happy times must end, and the happier the sooner. At 1 short week's close they hurried on to Perugia. And how full Alan had been of Perugia beforehand! He loved every stone of the town, every shadow of the hillsides, he told Herminia at Florence, and Herminia started on her way accordingly well prepared to fall quite as madly in love with the Umbrian capital as Alan himself had done. The railway journey indeed seemed extremely pretty. What a march of sweet pictures! They mounted with creaking wheels the slow ascent up the picturesque glen where the Arno runs deep, to the white towers of Arezzo, then Cortona throned in state on its lonely hilltop, and girt by its gigantic Etruscan walls. Next the low bank, the lucid green water, the olive-clad slopes of reedy Trasimene. Last of all, the sere hills and city-capped heights of their goal, Perugia. For its name's sake alone, Herminia was prepared to admire the antique Umbrian capital, and Alan loved it so much, and was so determined she ought to love it too, that she was ready to be pleased with everything in it. Until she arrived there. And then, oh, poor heart! What a grievous disappointment! It was late April weather when they reached the station at the foot of that high hill where Augusta Perugia sits lording it on her throne over the wedded valleys of the Tiber and the Clitumnus. Tramontana was blowing. No rain had fallen for weeks. The slopes of the lower Apennines, ever dry and dusty, shone still drier and dustier than Alan had yet beheld them. Herminia glanced up at the long white road, thick in deep grey powder, that led by endless zigzags along the dreary slope to the long white town on the shadeless hilltop. At first sight alone, Perugia was a startling disillusion to Herminia. She didn't yet know how bitterly she was doomed hereafter to hate every dreary, dirty street in it. But she knew at the first blush that the Perugia she had imagined and pictured to herself didn't really exist and had never existed. She had figured in her own mind a beautiful breezy town, high set on a peaked hill, in fresh and mossy country. She had envisaged the mountains to her soul as clad with shady woods and strewn with huge boulders, under whose umbrageous shelter bloomed waving masses of the pretty pale blue Apennine anemones she saw sold in big bunches at the street corners in Florence. She had imagined, in short, that Umbria was a wilder Italian Wales, as fresh, as green, as sweet-scented, as fountain-fed. And she knew pretty well whence she had derived that strange and utterly false conception. She had fancied Perugia as one of those mountain villages described by Macaulay, the sort of hilltop stronghold that, hid by beech and pine, like an eagle's nest, hangs on the crest of purple Apennine. Instead of that, what manner of land did she see actually before her? Dry and shadeless hillsides, tilled with obtrusive tilth to their topmost summit, ploughed fields and hoary olive groves silvering to the wind in interminable terraces. Long suburbs, unlovely in their gaunt, bare squalor, stretching like huge arms of some colossal cuttlefish over the spurs and shoulders of that desecrated mountain. No woods, no moss, no coolness, no greenery. All nature toned down to one monotonous greyness. And this dreary desert was indeed the place where her baby must be born, the baby predestined to regenerate humanity. Oh, why did they ever leave that enchanted Florence? Meanwhile, Alan had got together the luggage and engaged a ramshackle Perugian cab, for the public vehicles of Perugia are perhaps, as a class, the most precarious and incoherent known to science. However, the luggage was bundled onto the top by Our Lady's grace, without dissolution of continuity. The lean-limbed horses were induced, by explosive volleys of sound Tuscan oaths, to make a feeble and spasmodic effort, and bit by bit the sad little cavalcade began slowly to ascend the interminable hill that rises by long loops to the platform of the Prefettura. That drive was the gloomiest Herminia had ever yet taken. Was it the natural fastidiousness of her condition, she wondered, or was it really the dirt and foul smells of the place that made her sicken at first sight of the wind-swept purlieus? Perhaps a little of both. For in dusty weather, Perugia is the most endless town to get out of in Italy, and its capacity for the production of unpleasant odours is unequalled, no doubt, from the Alps to Calabria. As they reached the bare white platform at the entry to the upper town, where Pope Paul's grim fortress once frowned to overawe the audacious souls of the liberty-loving Umbrians, She turned mute eyes to Alan for sympathy. And then, for the first time, the terrible truth broke over her that Alan wasn't in the least disappointed or disgusted. He knew it all before. He was accustomed to it, and liked it. As for Alan, he misinterpreted her glance indeed, and answered with that sort of proprietary pride we all of us assume towards a place we love and are showing off to a newcomer. "Yes, I thought you'd like this view, dearest. Isn't it wonderful, wonderful? That's Assisi over yonder, that strange white town that clings by its eyelashes to the sloping hillside. And those are the snow-clad heights of the Gran Sasso beyond, and that's Montefalco to the extreme right, where the sunset gleam just catches the hilltop." His words struck dumb horror into Herminia's soul. Poor child, how she shrank at it! It was clear then, instead of being shocked and disgusted, Alan positively admired this human Sahara. With an effort, she gulped down her tears and her sighs, and pretended to look with interest in the directions he pointed. She could see nothing in it at all but dry hillsides, crowned with still drier towns, unimagined stretches of sultry suburb, devouring wastes of rubbish, and foul immemorial kitchen middens. And the very fact that for Alan's sake she couldn't bear to say so, seeing how pleased and proud he was of Perugia, as if it had been built from his own design, made the bitterness of her disappointment more difficult to endure. She would have given anything at that moment for an ounce of human sympathy. She had to learn in time to do without it. They spent that night at the comfortable hotel, perhaps the best in Italy. Next morning they were to go hunting for apartments in the town, where Alan knew of a suite that would exactly suit them. After dinner, in the twilight, filled with his artistic joy at being back in Perugia, his beloved Perugia, he took Herminia out for a stroll, with a light wrap round her head, on the terrace of the Prefettura. The air blew fresh and cool now, with a certain mountain sharpness, for, as Alan assured her with pride, they stood 1,700 feet above the level of the Mediterranean. The moon had risen. The sunset glow had not yet died off the slopes of the Assisi hillsides. It streamed through the perforated belfry of San Domenico. It steeped in rose-colour the slender and turreted shaft of San Pietro, Perugia's pennon, the arrowhead of Umbria. It gilded the gaunt houses that jut out upon the spine of the Borgo hill into the valley of the Tiber. Beyond rose shadowy Apennines, on whose aerial flanks towns and villages shone out clear in the mellow moonlight. Far away on their peaks, faint specks of twinkling fire marked indistinguishable sites of high hilltop castles. Alan turned to her proudly. "Well, what do you think of that?" he asked, with truly personal interest. Herminia could only gasp out in a half-reluctant way, "It's a beautiful view, Alan. Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful." But she felt conscious to herself it owed its beauty in the main to the fact that the twilight obscured so much of it. Tomorrow morning the bare hills would stand out once more in all their pristine bareness. The white roads would shine forth as white and dusty as ever. The obtrusive rubbish heaps would press themselves at every turn upon eye and nostril. She hated the place, to say the truth. It was a terror to her to think she had to stop so long in it. Most famous towns, in fact, need to be twice seen. The first time briefly to face the inevitable disappointment to our expectations. The second time at leisure to reconstruct and appraise the surviving reality. Imagination so easily beggars performance. Rome, Cairo, the Nile are obvious examples. The grand exceptions are Venice and Florence. In a lesser degree, Bruges, Munich, Pisa. As for Umbria, 'tis a poor thing. Our own Devon snaps her fingers at it. Moreover, to say the truth, Herminia was too fresh to Italy to appreciate the smaller or second-rate towns at their real value. Even northerners love Florence and Venice at first sight. Those take their hearts by storm, but Perugia, Siena, Orvieto are an acquired taste, like olives and caviar, and it takes time to acquire it. Alan had not made due allowance for this psychological truth of the northern natures. A Celt in essence, thoroughly Italianate himself, and with a deep love for the picturesque, which often makes men insensible to dirt and discomfort, he expected to Italianise Herminia too rapidly. Herminia, on the other hand, belonged more strictly to the intellectual and somewhat inartistic English type. The picturesque alone did not suffice for her. Cleanliness and fresh air were far dearer to her soul than the quaintest street corners, the oddest old archways. She pined in Perugia for a green English hillside. The time, too, was unfortunate, after no rain for weeks, for rainlessness, besides doubling the native stock of dust, brings out to the full the ancestral Etruscan odours of Perugia. So when next morning Herminia found herself installed in a dingy flat in a morose palazzo in the main street of the city, she was glad that Alan insisted on going out alone to make needful purchases of groceries and provisions, because it gave her a chance of flinging herself on her bed in a perfect agony of distress and disappointment, and having a good cry all alone at the aspect of the home where she was to pass so many eventful weeks of her existence. Dusty, gusty Perugia. Oh, baby, to be born for the freeing of woman! Was it here? Was it here you must draw your first breath? In an air polluted by the vices of centuries. End of chapter 10.